Finney Systematic Theology, Chapter 1. Moral Law. Law, in a sense of the term both sufficiently popular and scientific for my purpose, is a rule of action. In its generic signification, it is applicable to every kind of action, whether of matter or of mind, whether intelligent or unintelligent, whether free or necessary action. Physical law is a term that represents the order of sequence in all the changes that occur under the law of necessity, whether in matter or mind. I mean all changes, whether of state or action, that do not consist in the states or actions of free will. Physical law is the law of the material universe. It is also the law of mind so far as its states and changes are involuntary. All mental states or actions which are not free and sovereign actions of will must occur under and be subject to physical law. They cannot possibly be accounted for except as they are ascribed to the law of necessity or force. Moral law is a rule of moral action with sanctions. It is the rule to which moral agents ought to conform all their voluntary actions, and is enforced by sanctions equal to the value of the precept. It is the rule for the government of free and intelligent action as opposed to necessary and unintelligent action. It is the law of liberty as opposed to the law of necessity, of motive and free choice as opposed to force of every kind. Moral law is primarily a rule for the direction of the action of free will and strictly of free will only. But secondarily, and less strictly, it is the rule for the regulation of all those actions and states of mind and body that follow the free actions of will by a law of necessity. Thus, moral law controls involuntary mental states and outward action only by securing conformity of the actions of free will to its precept. The essential attributes of moral law are, number one, subjectivity. It is and must be an idea of reason developed in the mind of the subject. It is an idea or conception of that state of will or course of action which is obligatory upon a moral agent. No one can be a moral agent or the subject of moral law unless he has this idea developed, for this idea is identical with the law. It is the law developed or revealed within himself, and thus he becomes a law to himself, his own reason affirming his obligation to conform to this idea or law. Number two, objectivity. Moral law may be regarded as a rule of duty prescribed by the supreme lawgiver and external to self. When thus contemplated, it is objective. Number three, liberty as opposed to necessity. The precept must lie developed in the reason as a rule of duty, a law of moral obligation, a rule of choice, or of ultimate intention, declaring that which a moral agent ought to choose, will, intend. But it does not, must not, cannot possess the attribute of necessity in its relations to the actions of free will. It must not, cannot possess an element or attribute of force in any such sense as to render conformity of the will to its precept unavoidable. This would confound it with physical law. Number four, fitness. It must be the law of nature, that is, its precept must prescribe and require just those actions of the will which are suitable to the nature and relations of moral beings, and nothing more nor less. That is, the intrinsic value of the well-being of God and of the universe being given as the ground, and the nature and relations of moral agents or beings as the condition of the obligation. The reason hereupon necessarily affirms the intrinsic propriety and fitness of choosing this good, and of consecrating the whole being to its promotion. This is what is intended by the law of nature. It is the law or rule of action imposed on us by God in and by the nature which he has given us. Number five, universality. The conditions and circumstances being the same, it requires and must require of all moral agents the same things in whatever world they may be found. Number 6, impartiality. Moral law is no respecter of persons, knows no privileged classes. It demands one thing of all, without regard to anything except the fact that they are moral agents. By this, it is not intended that the same course of outward conduct is required of all, but the same state of heart in all, that all shall have one ultimate intention, that all shall consecrate themselves to one end, that all shall entirely conform in heart and life to their nature and relations. 7. Practicability. That which the precept demands must be possible to the subject. That which demands a natural impossibility is not and cannot be moral law. The true definition of law excludes the supposition that it can, under any circumstances, demand an absolute impossibility. Such a demand could not be in accordance with the nature and relations of moral agents, and therefore practicability must always be an attribute of moral law. To talk of inability to obey moral law is to talk nonsense. Number 8, independence. It is an eternal and necessary idea of the divine reason. It is the eternal, self-existent rule of the divine conduct, the law which the intelligence of God prescribes to himself. Moral law, as we shall see hereafter more fully, does not and cannot originate in the will of God. It eternally existed in the divine reason. It is the idea of that state of will which is obligatory upon God, upon condition of his natural attributes, or in other words, upon condition of his nature. As a law, it is entirely independent of his will, just as his own existence is. It is obligatory also upon every moral agent, entirely independent of the will of God. Their nature and relations being given, and their intelligence being developed, moral law must be obligatory upon them, and it lies not in the option of any being to make it otherwise. Their nature and relations being given, to pursue a course of conduct suited to their nature and relations is necessarily and self-evidently obligatory, independent of the will of any being. Number 9, immutability. Moral law can never change or be changed. It always requires of every moral agent a state of heart and course of conduct precisely suited to his nature and relations. Whatever his nature is, his capacity and relations are entire conformity to just that nature, those capacities and relations, so far as he is able to understand them, is required at every moment, and nothing more nor less. If capacity is enlarged, the subject is not thereby rendered capable of works of supererogation, of doing more than the law demands. For the law still, as always, requires the full consecration of his whole being to the public interests. If by any means whatever his ability is abridged, moral law, always and necessarily consistent with itself, still requires that what is left, nothing more or less, shall be consecrated to the same end as before. Whatever demands more or less than entire, universal, and constant conformity of heart and life to the nature, capacity, and relations of moral agents, be they what they may, is not and cannot be moral law. If therefore the capacity is by any means abridged, the subject does not thereby become incapable of rendering full obedience. For the law still demands and urges that the heart and life shall be fully conformed to the present existing nature, capacity, and relations. Anything that requires more or less than this cannot be moral law. Moral law invariably holds one language. It never changes its requirement. Thou shalt love, or be perfectly benevolent, is its uniform and its only demand. This demand it never varies and never can vary. It is as immutable as God is, and for the same reason. To talk of letting down or altering moral law is to talk absurdity. The thing is naturally impossible. No being has the right or the power to do so. The supposition overlooks the very nature of moral law. Moral law is not a statute, an enactment that has its origin or its foundation in the will of any being. It is the law of nature, the law which the nature or constitution of every moral agent imposes on himself, and which God imposes upon us, because it is entirely suited to our nature and relations, and is therefore naturally obligatory upon us. It is the unalterable demand of the reason that the whole being, whatever there is of it at any time, shall be entirely consecrated to the highest good of universal being. And for this reason, God requires this of us with all the weight of his authority.